Okay, so I am here to talk about how children should not be playing violent video games. And the reason they should not be playing violent video games is because it affects them psychologically, and because they're too immature to be able to be handling these games. So, my first source was from a man named Chris Rowan, and he states that children under the age of 12 should not be playing violent video games. So, the reason that he says this is because they have aggressive behaviors and thoughts. And the reason for this is because there are kids that spend countless hours um, on their video game consoles. And since they spend such a huge amount of time on these consoles, it becomes like a part of their everyday life, and it just becomes a part of their brain, and it kind of just stays in there and can really affect the way these kids grow up. So as these kids grow up and they're playing these violent video games as these premature, immature kids, they use it at school. So when they go to school, they use violent actions, which starts with thoughts. So their thoughts start to become more violent. They start getting more angry easier. And these kids are watching this and they're seeing it and they're kind of like, oh, like that is how I'm going to act. That's how, because they think it's fine because they see these video games and they're like, oh, that's fine, that's okay. And so it starts out with the thoughts, and so they start thinking more angry and they get angry at their parents or at their friends or anything like that. And so it only starts with the thoughts, and then once the thoughts aren't enough, it starts becoming an action, and so they get angry, and it affects people at school, it affects people at their home, it affects their friends, it can affect anybody. And what happens is their actions are just so angry that it builds up, and um, they have to let it out. So they start fighting, they start using their hands, they start becoming more violent. And another one of my sources from a man named Park, he talks about how kids that play violent video games are more likely to become more violent in the way that it might even be with a gun, where they are used to using these guns in these video games, and it kind of sparks in their head that it's okay, and that's how it might be when they're older and they're like, oh, shooting is okay, because they become numb to the fact, which is also what the man Harding said in one of his articles, that children become numb to the fact that um, violence is okay, and they don't know because they're so young and they're exposed to it as at such a young age that they're not used to violence being something wrong. They've just always seen it, they've always been around it, and their parents don't say anything. So a big part of the problem is that Harding says that kids spend 13 hours in front of a TV screen. So these kids are spending countless hours, 13 hours a week on a gaming console, which makes them become addicted. And these parents are not monitoring what they are watching or what these kids are playing, um, because they just buy them the video games because they're popular, or because the parents don't really care. They're like, oh, like, it's just a video game, like, it's not a big deal. And so it is a big deal, and they grow up to be more violent, and that's just one of the biggest problems, because it can become something super serious. Not only can they just be aggressive like at school and like with their hands, but like once their hands is enough, they see like, oh, they use guns in games, like why not use guns like when I'm older, which is a huge problem. So they believe that parents really need to monitor what they're watching. They need to have the kids in front of a screen that they can see as well. They need to have them in an open area. They need to buy kids games that are appropriate for their age, and not let them have something that shouldn't be what they have. And they shouldn't have rated R games where it's supposed to be for 18-year-olds that are more mature and not not mentally ready for that. So they talk about the psychological development to that, and Park also mentions that the um, psychological part that can really just affect their brain, and how it just, like how it talks about how that part just gets numb. And so they talk about a solution, and they talk about how bringing kids away from video games, because since in this generation there are very much kids that are just so addicted to their video games, and so that's all they do. They go to school and then they come home, and that's all they do. And they go home and they go home and then they come home and they just play their video games, and they do it for hours. And a solution that a man named, oh, actually it was from CNN. It was a website from CNN, and he talks about how parents should try to drive their kids away from only playing video games, how they should suggest to do something with their friends or go play outside or even do something with their family, and just kind of pull them away from that, because 90% of kids do play video games, which is also from Park, and he talks about 90% of the video games that they are playing are violent. And so there are just huge consequences to that, such as just poor brain development and kids becoming more violent, and obviously like the consequences towards other people and towards the people around them. So they just want to let parents know to completely monitor what your kids are watching, especially if they're under the age of 12, and just let the kids grow up mentally that the way that they were supposed